day to all, and welcome to another beautiful day in America's neighborhood, as well as to the 18th episode of the Constitution in American Life, with a couple of real Americans from the Midwest center of our country, as well as an elitist from the left coast. I don't know exactly where I fit in on this scale of a real Americanist. I don't know. I am a native Californian, but I reside in Bakersfield, a place not exactly known for its elite institutions and environment. In fact, if you look it up, Bakersfield ranks 127th out of 182 cities on the Quality of Life Index. We are at or near the bottom of every socioeconomic measurement, which means we can flip it and claim number one in suckiness. However, moving on, I am sleepy better these days than I was just a year ago. I used to wake up with cold sweats worrying about the threats to our way of life posed by Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. But now I'm told that America's true enemies are Denmark, Panama, Greenland, and Canada. Those countries create as much fear in me as the San Francisco Giants do to the Los Angeles Dodgers. So, in this, our second to last episode, we will be addressing Unit 2, Question 3 from the We the People, Citizen and the Constitution National Finals program, where students are asked to address the tenor and essence of the debate over slavery at Philadelphia and how those debates translated into ongoing debates over racial justice. But before we get to that discussion on the Constitution of Slavery, let's check in with the band and probe their thoughts on this day in history, 1775, when Patrick Henry gave his most famous speech at the Second Virginia Convention, which included the phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death." So is this a need to know, nice to know, or nuts to know, gentlemen? Professor Kavanaugh.
Um, Somewhere between nice to know and need to know. It's a mid-major. It becomes part of that great narrative we can tell about ourselves. But I'm not sure that Patrick Henry was picking up a musket anytime soon. So that might have been a safe statement for him to make at that point in time. You know,
Yeah,
like
you
kind of like
anticipated. Yeah, you anticipated my follow-up to you. It was like, did we ever find him in the field of battle?
kind of like some of the chicken hawk leaders we've had in the more recent past that are very quick to send somebody else's sons and daughters off. But it's nice for that narrative we like to tell ourselves about things.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I'm with Chris on this. I think it's nice to know. I think we hear that phrase a lot. It's important for, I think, students to know where it's coming from and in the context, but also know that at the time he was speechifying, there was a lot of people speechifying and writing important things. And I don't know, it's an interesting sort of just research question of why that phrase has stood the test of time, and many more, like our good friend Thomas Paine, has not in some ways. So
let's go to Patrick Henry's good friend, Professor Tim Moore here. First thing, did he actually say it, Tim? Did he actually say, "Give me liberty or give me death"?
Likely, yeah.
Okay, because I came across a source that said allegedly said it.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's some discussion. I'm kind of shocked. I'm kind of shocked because I'm going to go somewhere between nuts to know and nice to know.
Whoa.
And well, a couple reasons. First of all, Patrick Henry was, I think, what we would call a blowhard. I mean, he hyperbole was his game, and he was very good at it. And I think he's known because of his, you called it speechifying, but I have a hard time with him. I have a personal, I don't know if it's animus, but I don't particularly like Patrick Henry because like if we plopped him now, I think he would wear us out with his speechifying and pontificating, and he just if you read his speeches in the Virginia ratification debates, they go on for pages and pages and he wanders all over the universe. So I don't particularly I have a hard time thinking objectively about him. So that's probably why I'm going to go nuts to know, mid minor, I guess is that's the category. But it's kind of one of those lines that and I'm surprised that Chris and Mike are a little more favorable to him than I would be because they're a little more um, suspicious of the founding period. So I'm kind of surprised that you guys are pretty generous, and I'm not so much. So
Was maybe because we don't know as much.
Yeah.
well, no, but still the narrative. I think Mike's point about the narrative, or no, yeah, Chris, your point about the narrative we tell ourselves. In the reality of he's a blowhard, didn't pick up any weaponry here, and so.
I like one scholar described him and said it was kind of a nice way of saying effusive oratory.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, was he like that in the Senate?
The Senate?
Didn't he win the seat for the Senate, or was it what?
He didn't
What?
run. He
Who did
made
Madison run again? Didn't Madison run for the Senate?
Monroe.
Oh,
Monroe,
it's Monroe.
the
Okay.
House.
The
Okay.
House. Yeah, the House. I mean, Henry had a hand in all of that maneuvering, but yeah.
Yeah, he was not a fan of Madison, was he?
No.
Yeah, okay, that's maybe where I'm getting confused here, is that I know there was some animosity. Well, gentlemen, thank you for your insights on Patrick Henry there. Now it's time to share your thoughts on the tranquil and non-controversial subject of slavery. We are going to begin with our friend who resides in the center of real America, where men are men and women chew tobacco and have their own personalized gun racks in their trucks, Professor Chris Kavanaugh. So, Chris, explain to me how the Congress of the Confederation can ban slavery in the Northwest Ordinance, but the delegates to Philadelphia, and some of these are the same people, allow slavery in the new Constitution. It seems like somewhat of a disconnect to me. So if you can cleanse that out for our students and teachers.
Well, that's 1787 is no different than 2025 because money makes the world go round, baby. And the Southern delegates didn't want to open up that territory to slavery because they're worried about competition for tobacco, indigo, and hemp. Even there's a guy, Virginia delegate William Grayson, he wrote a letter to Monroe, who we were just talking about, right? That the clause, I'm gonna quote it here. The clause respecting slavery was agreed to by Southern members for the purpose of preventing tobacco and indigo from being made on the northwest side of the Ohio, as well as for several other political reasons. And then in a footnote later that not only just indigo, but also hemp they alluded to. So yeah, they didn't want to see slavery spread into the Northwest Territory because they don't want competition. And you see that as well when we get later down the road when we start talking about popular sovereignty. People they're opposed to slavery, but it's not because of the morality of it. It's because of the competition of free labor versus enslaved labor. Even all the way out to Oregon when Oregon was thinking about becoming a territory. So
Well,
that's
yeah, well, I am curious because within a generation, if we look at 1820 as kind of a key moment, the slave states, the southern states, are now arguing for open territory for the expansion of slavery. So in that one generation, is it still about money, or is it
well,
about political power?
I think it's both. I think what happens is you get Eli Whitney through his invention of the cotton gin, saves an institution that some of the framers thought was going to die out. It kind of was until the invention of the cotton gin because it was so expensive. It was you're not making your profit by enslaving people that you were, and then all of a sudden cotton becomes extremely popular and profitable through the invention of the cotton gin, and then you see the switching over from what it could be rice or indigo or tobacco or hemp or these other cash crops to cotton becoming king. And then part of it also does become about political power, David. That's a good point when you think about when we started admitting states to the Union. And I always joke about in class, the fulcrum is the Senate. right? And they're just trying to maintain that teeter-totter balanced in the Senate by, okay, we're going to have a free state and then a slave state come in. And so that is about maintaining that political balance of power because of the tariff was such a big issue. So,
Well, and that's part, but that's also part of the disconnect in my own mind here is because I understand the profit motive or the money idea you're talking about with the Confederation and Northwest Ordinance, but aren't they, and maybe this is a silly thought now that I give it a little bit more thought, that I just wonder, aren't they advocating power to a certain degree by voting to not allow slavery in the Northwest Ordinance?
I don't know if they have that kind of that kind of foresight in terms of you thinking about the electoral votes that would go.
Yeah, well, yeah, electoral Senate, but also even within the Confederation, that if there's no slavery as those states are added, technically they're going to be non-slave states, aren't they? Even
Right.
if the Confederation were to
Well,
survive.
and I think this goes back to the second part of your question because they felt like there was enough protection in the Constitution to protect their institution of slavery. That there was going to be, I mean, we know that the fugitive slave clause, or excuse me, there was a fugitive slave clause both in the Northwest Ordinance as well as in the Constitution. That that they're going to protect the importation of such persons for 20 years. I think we'll talk about that in a second, but so I think there was an idea that we can protect our livelihoods. We can protect this institution of slavery in the body of the Constitution. Uh, so we'll be all right. Plus the fact that you understand the Confederation Congress is different than the Constitutional Convention.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I'd like to kind of weigh in with the Constitution. Chris led out with an economic argument, and I'd like to pose that there's a constitutional reason that Congress does this. One is primarily I think it's not apples to apples to compare the Northwest territories to policies regarding states. I mean, under the Articles, you have sovereign states. And, traditionally the view is that Congress has very limited clout with sovereign states under the Articles. That limitation on Congress is not there regarding territories. Now, did they act unconstitutionally or extra constitutionally by passing the Northwest Ordinance to begin with? Maybe. But my argument is there's a constitutional reason they can do it in territories, but they can't make statements and policies regarding sovereign states.
There's a Chief Justice in a couple of years that's going to tell you that you're wrong.
Right. But that's down the road of history too.
So, Tim, let's pick up on that. Somewhat what Chris was saying. I'm wondering, to what extent was there a debate over the Fugitive Slave Clause and the Importation of Slave Clause of 1808, both at the Philadelphia Convention and ratification? Because the question that the students have to deal with seems to imply that there really wasn't that much of a pushback against the pro-slave element, that it wasn't feasible, all right, for the delegates to be opposed to slavery. So I'm wondering about your thoughts about those clauses and anything else.
Well, at Philadelphia, there's very, very sparse discussion on fugitive slave clause. And I think my take on that is largely because they have a statement about the fugitive slave clause pre-existing their discussions at Philadelphia. Chris mentioned that there is a fugitive slave clause in the Articles. So they've been wrestling with this as newly formed states during the Revolution, and it's kind of codified in the when the Articles are ratified. So I think very little discussion in Philadelphia is in some ways very predictable because it already exists in their minds and in their policies. Regarding non-importation at Philadelphia, the discussion was largely on if we continue importation indefinitely. Most of the discussion was about what impact that would have on representation. So there's the overall thesis statement at Philadelphia. There's very little discussion about the morality of slavery. Okay. Very little. I mean, there's a few speeches, Mason's most notably, about I think he called it an evil. I've got the quote here somewhere, but it's shocking. The morality piece is almost totally invisible at Philadelphia. So non-importation, a lot of the discussion was about the impact of importation on representation, especially if they've bargained on the 3/5 clause. So I mean, it's students is very painful to read. It's just painful to read their discussions about slavery in these two clauses at Philadelphia. I mean, there is an interesting side comment by Oliver Ellsworth. He actually predicts the he gets a crystal ball out and he speculates that this this importation clause is not going to be that important because something like domestic increase of slaves is far more economically viable than importation. So he takes a dim view of the importation being kind of a block and a slowdown and eventual abolition of slavery. So that speech was really it caught my attention where he makes this prediction, which actually becomes to Chris's point that Whitney throws gasoline on this fire of expansion. When it comes to ratification, it's a very difficult thing to answer because there's a regional variations. Like New England has certain issues about slavery. The middle colonies have certain issues about these two phrases, and the South have differing views on these two phrases. So it's not very nice and clean breakdown on these two clauses when you go region by region. In New England, there's a lot of moral discussion, and I think, in my estimation, that's because of the Quaker presence in not only the middle, but especially pressing in Rhode Island. The Quakers are quite apoplectic about the allowing importation till 1808. So that's a lot of the discussion in New England did boil down to favoring the South in terms of increased representation. In New England, when it comes to non-importation, there was some discussion about, well, this non-importation or this ban in 1808 is ridiculous because all it does is it stops Congress from passing a law. So there's a lot of speculation in New England about, well, states will just go on ahead, because Congress, the prohibition is on Congress. So that's kind of interesting that states could continue if Congress didn't. Or even if it
Wait,
did.
is that just because they don't know? I mean, I thought that the Commerce Clause is the power of Congress to regulate, trade between the states and the nation and foreign countries. And
Well,
yeah,
okay, foreign countries. So if you're importing from Africa, are they clearly defined as in the European sense as nation states? So there's that little caveat too.
so you've triggered my curiosity. Is there a sequence here that, just for my own, that is, does the 1808 clause come after, all right, the 3/5 and after the other slave elements there? Because you
Oh,
said this gets down to representation, so I'm kind of going,
um, I don't know how to answer that safely. A lot of this stuff is all jumbled together and they revisit stuff constantly.
right.
So that's a great question, David. And I don't know the timeline on that, but that might be that I think your question is very critical in ciphering that out, how that got parsed out at Philadelphia, per se. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Well, as
So
far as
yeah,
I'm sorry, as far as
go
the
ahead, Chris.
non-importation, though, I mean, even Madison says like 20 years ought to be enough time for enough mischief, I think is
Mischief, yeah.
the word he uses. So even a guy that, relied on enslaving people for his livelihood, said 20 years ought to be enough time. And there's a
Yeah.
great scene in John Adams, the HBO series and they're sitting is when Jefferson first gives his draft of the Declaration to Adams and Franklin's reading it, and he's with a critical eye, the Dave Richmond critical read there, And he gets to the paragraph about where, Jefferson condemns the king for allowing the slave trade. And Franklin kind of shoots him the look, and I'm paraphrasing. He goes, "Well, wouldn't that mean that your slaves would be more valuable then?" And Jefferson, being Mr. Aloof, to never say anything, he kind of leans over. He goes, I hadn't really considered that." And you're like, right.
Another feature in the South is like to Chris's point about the Northwest Ordinance. During ratification, Virginian and Maryland folks were quite optimistic on the gradual disappearance thesis that this 20-year, and to Chris's observation, Madison's observation, they were quite optimistic. And actually, in many cases, the Federalists in the South wanted a ban and even hinted at the Commerce Clause too. So it harkens back to the discussions that they were having about the Northwest Territories and what kind of slave policies would apply out in the Northwest Ordinance. They were having that similar discussions during ratification. The Southern Anti-Federalists sometimes would make the argument in the South that we need this 20-year ban is great. We wish it would have been shoved out longer because we need economic development. They argued that they needed slaves for their economy to develop. So the larger point about these clauses especially on non-importation, there's a lot of variation. The Southern Federalists were fine with the 3/5. They saw it as a benefit. But there's a lot of nuance when it comes to non-importation discussions.
So, Professor Williams, I'm going to preface this question to you with saying that we're going to talk a little bit about Dred Scott, obviously a seminal case when it comes to slavery and race in America. Post World War II, Justice Taney and throughout 19th, 20th century history, Justice Taney or Taney, however you want to pronounce it, becomes fairly, ridiculed for this decision, at least in the legal field, is my understanding, if not the historical field as well. The American Bar Association puts out lists every year, the 10 most important cases or the 10 worst cases, and the number one worst case every year that I receive this list is Dred Scott. So I preface that, and that kind of gives a context to my question. So in that decision of 1857, the court stated that a black man had no rights that white society shall respect. Based upon your understanding of the language of the Constitution of 1787, do you agree that Taney has a point or that Taney was right?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it kind of brings us full circle to where we started this season, talking about Kermit Roosevelt's book and how we need to really tie ourselves in knots to try to make the Constitution fit with what our current values are. I would say that the consensus of legal scholars and political scientists today is that Taney got his history wrong and that he overreached. That to get to the question of whether Congress had the power for the Missouri Compromise in 1820 wasn't something he had to decide, and that he misunderstood his history. So that's where the consensus is. There is a really fascinating book and a book review that I'll put into the show notes for sure by Mark Graber. It's about 20 years old now, called "The Problem of Constitutional Evil." Right.
Yep.
And he's very explicit that he's not defending the decision, but he makes a political science and a historical argument about how Taney actually had it right. And he frames it as, in 1787, we basically put together the Constitution as a set of compromises. The fancy word he uses is that we have a consociational government. We have a grand coalition between the South and the North. And to make that work, the South has to have a veto point, and it's on slavery. And he argues that Taney was respecting that compromise, and that folks like Lincoln were not respecting the compromise. And his final statement on this is that we have to admit that sometimes constitutions, not just our constitution, but maybe every constitution, has some evil built into it by design to just get it across the finish line. Now, that is not the consensus argument out there in the legal field, but it's one that we'll put in the show notes so the students can kind of grapple with this. The counter argument well, the way you frame the question is tricky, right? To look at the U.S. Constitution,
They always are. They always are tricky.
to look at the U.S. Constitution, we've already talked about a few of the ways that while slavery was not mentioned and blacks were not mentioned, that they were obviously invoked. What we haven't mentioned yet is the Constitution says nothing about citizenship. I mean, it uses citizen in Article 4, right? Privileges and immunities, but there's no discussion. That's going to be left to the states. So if you look at what states are doing at the founding, there are some states where blacks do have rights. They have some social rights, they have political rights. And for those that critique the Taney decision and his use of history, would say, no, you're not reading the history correctly, that black men will never have rights that whites respect, because they did in certain places in the United States in 1787. So my own feeling on it is I'm a little sympathetic to Graeber's argument. And again, pleased to not put this out as a meme that I'm saying Dred Scott was a good decision. But I do think that within the confines of the constitutional system and the value structure and the culture that Taney is in, I think that statement reflects what probably a majority of Americans at the time thought.
Yeah.
And I don't see anything in the Constitution that would force his hand. The only thing I read this week was that this is not the original Constitution, but we've looked at the Bill of Rights. Some have argued, well, the Bill of Rights there's no racial distinctions in the Bill of Rights. So perhaps that's an opening of sorts. But it's surprisingly a little more difficult and complicated question to answer than we'd like to, because we just want to say, no, Taney was wrong. From the Declaration to the Constitution, these rights were there for all of us. And again, go back and see our first episode of this national hearing season to see how we talk about Roosevelt's argument. It kind of aligns with this.
Well, and that's why I wanted you to talk about it, is because I believe in transparency and this desire to try to, erase, I think, some pragmatic and some realities of pre-Civil War society and what Taney's dealing with here. And this, again, this post-Civil War, let's just belittle Taney and his decision. I wanted students and teachers to, students especially, to understand that it is a little bit more complicated than modern society makes it out to be. Tim, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I jotted down here the title of the book. I forgot the author's name, Graeber, but I'm glad Mike mentioned this, because I mean, when it first came out, I read it, and after every chapter, I felt like I had to go take a shower, because I mean, his argument is the Constitution was a straitjacket for Taney, and he had no other choice but to try to thread the needle there. And so, but it was a tough book to read. But if you accept the premise that he's straitjacketed by the Constitution, it's a very interesting and challenging book to read. So I'm glad Mike mentioned it.
I'm sorry. I've got to push back that because Mike said this in his opening answer. Most of the stuff Taney gives us in his decision is dicta. It's not even addressing the constitutional question. So how can you be straitjacketed by the Constitution when you're not even addressing the constitutional question? Does Dred Scott have the ability to sue for his freedom? Yes or no? Right? That was the question in the case, and he goes beyond that. He goes way beyond that in his dicta. right? So I think that's I don't know. That's and I respect Mark Graber. I think he's a very good scholar. And here's a little insight. Just this is I love this story about Tawny. And it's a cultural thing because Mike has said this before. And justices don't exist, in this hermetically sealed vacuum. Tawny and his family, who, by the way, his wife was Francis Scott Key's sister, um, always they always vacation on the coast in, I think I want to say Virginia. But there's so much sectionalism in the early 1850s going on, and there was also a yellow fever outbreak where they were going to vacation, where their family had always vacationed. He had several daughters. One of his adult daughters, who is living in the north, I think I want to say Rhode Island, says, no, hey, we know that there's sickness on the coast. Come, you and mom and sister, come up to our place and vacation up here in the north. And Tawny wouldn't have anything to do with that. And you can read that in his letters. It's like, no, we're going where we've always gone. Well, his wife and his daughter both contract yellow fever and both die from it. And he is forced to sell their home and move to Washington, D.C. a month before he hears Dred Scott. So you think about this personal, this division. We're going where we've always been. It's in the South. We're tired of being looked down upon by the North, and everything's better now. Or even our traditional family vacation is being debated about, North and South kind of deal. No, we're going. And then through that stubbornness, his wife and one of his daughters pass because they contract the yellow fever. And then, a month later, he's got to sell the family home that all the kids grew up in and move to Washington, D.C., and then hear Dred Scott.
Well, he's not the first nor the last justice, to, stretch the, I guess, literal role that they're supposed to play. Wouldn't you agree? I
Oh,
mean, he's doing a favor to Buchanan.
Well, Buchanan had been in contact with him. Buchanan had been in contact with him before the opinion's even out. So Buchanan is already muddying the waters, right, about trying to get this opinion out of him.
Well, he's asking the court to do what Congress and himself wouldn't do. Try to come up with some kind of final word and solution to this problem that had it geometrically increased the tension within the United States. And again, I don't think that's necessarily the role of the court, but you kind of got to.
It's certainly not the role of the president to contact the sitting chief justice after they've heard the case and trying to influence him on the case in a private fashion. That's definitely not the role of the president. So definitely below board. But I just like that personal narrative, that story about Tawny, because because you wonder, why does he go beyond what he needed to go beyond? Why does he have to go on this diatribe, basically, after he issues the constitutional ruling, which the constitutional ruling was not all that shaky, but it's in his dicta that it gets really shaky and really bad history.
Also, on the personal note, Chris, didn't Tawny free his slaves?
Early on, he manumitted some of them, yes.
Yeah.
And he was actually opposed to it. He took some cases that, as a young attorney, that to do that. But I think, again, as you see this sectionalism and the vitriol on both sides get worse and worse, you see him, maintaining that Southern position, if you will.
Well, just for the students, to build on Chris's point about the importance of knowing more than just what happened in 1857, Tawny was appointed by Jackson, if I recall, and Jackson's presidency is one where the gloves really came off in terms of white supremacy, it seems to me. And Tawny was right there on the court as not only decisions affecting blacks, but affecting Native Americans as well are coming down. And so he has that sort of legacy from the 1820s and 30s.
Well, he was also denied the first time Jackson put him up. So he was not accepted the first time. Then Jackson had to put him up again, and then he was confirmed. So, and not only that, I think we mentioned on this program that Tawny was also the attorney for the city of Baltimore in Barron v. Baltimore.
Yeah.
Well, he's got a barrel full of resentments that probably come out there
Well, I
in the
think this
dig.
was just a final note about Tommy, and I am not I mean, I think this definitely belongs in the pits of constitutional hell, the Dred Scott decision to steal from Amar. But it's so crazy because his whole career up to this point was very involved in so many things. What an incredible legal career. And then he gets to that one opinion and it just shoots it all to hell.
Yeah, yeah. So, Professor Moore, kind of staying within that, well, within somewhat of the political realm of the issue of slavery. Thomas Jefferson described the slavery issue as comparable to holding a wolf by the ears. Between 1788 and 1860, I'm curious, what actions were taken by Congress or the states to diminish the problems posed by slavery and the slavery compromises in the Constitution? So how
Yeah.
did they try to fix this dilemma that Jefferson describes?
Well, I think in a lot of people's minds at the time, it was a damned if you do, damned if you don't. I mean, I think that's how I would summarize Jefferson's quote. Um, Now, that quote assumes several things about the enslaved people if they were to be freed. But I think that was kind of the prevailing attitude that this is a rock and a hard place. Um, it's interesting to me, the very first federal Congress received several petitions uh, from various abolitionist groups, and Ben Franklin actually submitted one of them. And the petition essentially was, get abolish slavery. Well, that's an easy one for the first Congress because they say, see 1808 clause, we can't touch it until for 20 years. So, there were some folks that were naively assuming that Congress would solve this problem for the country very quickly, and they could constitutionally punt. So predictably, I think the first, I guess, the traditional narrative is there's one, two, three, there's four things between your 88 to 1860. The Missouri Compromise obviously is an attempt to address the issue of slavery, and again, there's a bargain. There's a bargain that's achieved. Missouri in slave and Maine in is free. And they attempt to solve the problem of slavery in the Louisiana Purchase with 3630. So Congress is trying to, I don't know if they're trying to solve, they're trying to bargain. Because I think in some ways, Graeber's thesis, I do somewhat agree to the argument that there's a constitutional straitjacket here in the 87,
Well, can I jump
1787.
in? Wouldn't you agree that the Missouri Compromise is successful for 30 years? That until 1850 and the addition of the
Yeah,
Mexican territory,
sure.
there was general acceptance of the legal
Well,
status under Missouri.
uh, depends who you're asking whether it's successful or not.
Yeah.
Come on, David. I mean, I had to be in the position to push. Normally, that's Chris's role here to push back on that, but
Ask Elijah Lovejoy whether it was successful.
yeah, right, exactly, right,
Good point.
yeah, yeah.
The
He's got a lot of
students,
pushback.
Elijah P. Lovejoy was an abolitionist who was killed. So,
Illinois, I think.
yeah.
But the second big moment here is to your point, David, 1850, where there's the omnibus bill, as it was called. I think history books now call it the Compromise of 1850. And students, there are 7 provisions in that thing. And Congress is trying to solve issues of slavery. They monkey around with the border of Texas. They and the most amazing statement to me in the Compromise of 1850 was, and we absolve all responsibility. Well, no, there's 2 amazing things. Number one is we're going to allow states to determine the matter. So Congress is no longer, in that provision, is no longer trying to bargain. They're totally abdicating responsibility. And then the other thing that they do is, well, yeah, is they basically say going forward, states' popular sovereignty. Well, now wait a minute. The Constitution has all kinds of provisions where Congress had attempted and claimed jurisdiction over slavery issues in the West. See Missouri Compromise. Um, so, for Congress to turn around in 1850, to me, the most egregious, totally two-faced piece about the Compromise of 1850 is when they totally absolve all responsibility and turn it over to popular sovereignty. That is a remarkable abdication.
So our current Congress in the 21st century is just building on the cowardly behavior of Congresses that came before them.
Well, we could put it on the cowardly-o-meter and determine, who was more cowardly. But and then Kansas, Nebraska is the absolute disaster of let the states decide, where you've got the disaster of Bleeding Kansas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to Bleeding Kansas. So Congress tries to do all this. Now, the second part of your question is like, were these constitutionally viable solutions that they were attempting? Well, I think, and again, anytime you say this stuff, you come off as being pro-slavery. But I think, when you think about Missouri, I think they're trying to bargain. And as to Chris's point, the constitutional balance in the Senate is key in that. Do they want to make a decisions going forward, the 3630 line? So I think there's some constitutional thinking and viability there. That's awful. But again, is the Constitution a straitjacket on this? The other laws I see as less constitutionally viable than Missouri. And I'm not making the argument because Missouri is, the bright and shining object on that either. So
I think I don't want to go back and want to put a cherry on top of the importation of enslaved people. It was Jefferson as president that signs that, which is for the students to make sure you understand that by that time that they have been able to build their own enslaved populations, and they're no longer needed to import foreign slaves. They could just sell their own around. I think the other thing too with I'm going to push back on one of the words Tim used with Congress, and they weren't trying to solve anything. They were punting, continually punting. As you study American history, right to left, east to west, it's one just giant compromise after another, starting in Philadelphia, starting prior to Philadelphia, compromising. Of course, if you want to get a document that's going to get ratified, you have to compromise. We continue to compromise as we go from right to left, east to west, fulfilling our manifest destiny on the idea of slavery. And if you think about Stephen Douglas, the little giant from Illinois, the senator that puts out the concept of popular sovereignty, part of that is because he wants the Southern support to get the national rail hub to go through Chicago, which he gets. So the politics behind that, but I don't think Congress is trying to solve a damn thing. I think they're just continually punting it for the next generation.
I hear you, Chris, but to me, there's a substantive difference between the attempt to solve in 1820 and the abdication of making any decisions in one of those provisions of 1850. That's my point. It seems like a total abdication. I think is even worse than punting. It's a total abdication in 50. So I guess I'm juxtaposing 50 as attempting to bargain versus 1850 they punt and abdicate.
Mike?
Yeah, when I teach this from Philadelphia up through Dred Scott, it's always interesting because we value compromise. Like we value the idea of compromising. And today a lot of students I interact with are just like, why can't we compromise more? And when you're having this discussion, to Tim and Chris's point, I don't know, just what for me resonates is there has to be some basic principles of which you are compromising on. Like they have to be the foundation. And this was the question of slavery was the moral question for the first part of our republic. And we consistently compromised in ways of just putting that moral judgment aside. And I'd have students think about whatever they think is the moral issue of 2025 And when they're asking their whoever party that they're rooting for to compromise, to think about how you embed that into the compromise itself, that principle of which, okay, I will compromise, but I will not give up this principle or value. I don't know. It's an interesting for me teaching moment to talk about all these compromises.
Well, I've got a grin on my face because I want to push back. I just don't know who I want to push back on. Uh, and that is I'm kind of doing a constitutional happy dance, from the waist down here, because I think I finally convinced, or I finally see that Chris has joined me. We have talked about the issue of slavery and the Constitution for 4 years on this program. And almost every episode, I go out on a limb and I consider the framers cowards for making the compromise in the first place. And I've been told, oh, come on, David, union. All right, union was the priority, having a constitutional union, and you need to accept that reality. Well, now I think Chris went all the way back and said, "Hey, no, they've been blowing it since the beginning." Because I would argue, kind of with Tim, that they're trying to maintain that value, that standard, and that is union. All right, and therefore they've got to make compromises. 1820, 1850. All right. The thing is that as we move along historically, chronologically, the intensity of the debate, the
Yeah.
intensity of the issue is exponentially growing, which makes compromise more and more difficult because where Tim said in 1787, there's almost no record of a moral debate over slavery. By 1850, it to me is framed predominantly within the framework of a moral question there. So Chris, I'm glad you finally joined
Well,
me
but
and
that's why
condemn the
Taney pretty
framers.
much, but that's why Taney pretty much avoids all the moral discussion in his attempt to be legal. I mean, that's the great tragedy there.
Yeah, but the response to that is what? What is the response to his decision?
Well,
Depends
it
on where
depends
you
where you
are.
are. Yeah.
Well, I know that again, but we can simplify that north to south, slave, pro-slave, anti-slave. The moral argument, at least in the anti-slave territory, takes on a very, very passionate
Oh, sure.
place now in American, political society. There, the response to that, the push. I mean, some would argue it's the decision that sparks. All right, because on the heels
Yeah.
1858 we've got gosh, I'm trying to remember all the things. Then we got John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1850, all of this kind of stuff.
Well, I'd go back and say even honestly, and Tim already mentioned it, bloody Kansas. I mean, you're talking 1850 prior. I mean, John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry in Virginia. My goodness, he and some of his sons hacked 5 guys to death in Pottawatomie Creek, Kansas, all in the name of freeing the enslaved people.
Yeah.
You also get Thomas Jefferson calling the Missouri Compromise. He said it's like when the Missouri Compromise is reached, he says it's like a fire bell in the night. And the second half of that quote you used, David, is like it's like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you don't dare let it go.
Right.
The idea that Jefferson understood the immorality of it, but he also understood the financial, the whole idea of what the whole
There was,
economy.
yeah, because in the last analysis, there's no way to deal with this issue and maintain the union. You just can't do it. All right, because obviously one side of the debate wants either the immediate emancipation or the gradual emancipation, and to the southern states at the time, that was never going to be acceptable there. And going back to Bloody Kansas, isn't that a big motivation for Taney's decision and his dicta and Buchanan going to him? Is they're already seeing in 1857 flashes of a civil war emerging, of violence becoming the solution to this. And so,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if the events on the ground in Kansas were playing out much in his opinion. I don't know. I don't know. There's a record of that. So,
But
Uh, you're
it is true that Taney and Buchanan thought that this decision was gonna solve it.
Yeah.
It was gonna
yeah,
end it rather than cause it to spark.
It's interesting. Some of the Northerners in ratification said, "Let the South go.
Yeah.
Let's break it now." And so, I mean, you look back and think, that there's a crystal ball moment. So it appears in ratification if they're gonna be all blustery about us linking with them. I mean, there's in New England there was this because of the religious influences they called it the doctrine of imputed evil or no wait imputed guilt. If we are associated with these evil Southerners, we too inherit the guilt,
Yeah,
national guilt. So
yeah.
it's there's a religious principle that appears that drives them to say, let's sever the relationship now.
That reminds me. I'm not sure if this was a religious principle, but in a podcast I think we all listened to, it was last week, March 15th, right, was the date of the compromise. And Maine, who's split off from Massachusetts, right? A lot of Mainers were furious that they were being held hostage to becoming a state by the slave state of Missouri. And I'm not sure if religion played into it, but it was this feeling of like,
Yeah.
we don't want to get caught up in this. Like we're following the rules and we just want to join, but now you're making our admission
Yeah.
contingent on a slave state. So
Well, I think the crystal ball moment for me is Madison at the convention, right? And we teach the big split between the big states and the small states, and the great compromise and over representation. But Madison said that the division won't be between the large states and the small states; it'll be between the states with slaves and the states without. And it's almost, he's looking at that's you can see that, you can see it coming. And of course, we all know that because we know the history, and history is, looking backward as we do. But that's a pretty big moment, I think.
Well,
oh,
which is why Garrison calls the Constitution a bargain with the devil.
Yeah.
Covenant with death.
Yeah, covenant with death. So, Professor Kavanaugh, it's time to go into Mr. Moore's comfort zone, and that is presentism. The students are
And why doesn't
asked.
he get this question?
Well, I'm sure he'll have some thoughts and insights to it. You're more comfortable of moving back and forth between
Yes.
those worlds.
I just can't make up my mind. That's a problem.
One side's historian, one side's political scientist. All right, you're by academia. I don't know what term that would be, but that works for me. So there has been much talk in the last 40, 50 years about the responsibility of the United States government, to bring final justice to the issue of slavery, and not just the issue of slavery. And I tried in the years that I taught to also, bring to the forefront to the students that segregation is just one marginal lesser sin than slavery in many ways, because of the promise of the Civil War amendments being so violated and unfulfilled. But the last 40, 50 years, there has been much discussion about the idea of reparations to descendants of slaves. I'm wondering what you see as the key arguments for the idea of reparations and against the idea of reparations. And I talked to a friend recently about this, and they said the 14th Amendment was reparations, so we don't need them. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Whoa. Okay. Well, let me give you the bullet points in favor of, and the bullet points maybe opposed to, and then I'll tackle that last one. Certainly, acknowledging historical injustice. I think that's it's kind of like the Truth and Reconciliation that I know Mike's well acquainted with in South Africa. Economic disparities that rolled out of enslavement, compensation for unpaid labor. Perhaps back to the beginning, the symbolic healing, if moving towards that, and a moral responsibility for that. Arguments against, wow, it's going to be difficult in defining eligibility. Are we talking about a collective, or are we talking about individual responsibility? There are practical concerns in terms of cost. I hate to say that, but that's one of the arguments. And the potential for greater division if we continue to move down this road for that, and the uncertainty of the impact. What impact will it have? Are there alternative solutions to reparations? And to the there are arguments on both sides, and I think there are great arguments on. I cannot there are solid arguments. I'm going to say great. There are solid arguments on both sides of this debate towards reparations. Now, the last part about the 14th Amendment.
And let me clarify, I was not, well, no, their argument is that on the 14th Amendment, we created the policy of affirmative action, which is a 14th Amendment, is justified by the 14th Amendment, and therefore that was the reparations. That the affirmative action was reparations for African Americans, so we don't need monetary ones in a specific sense.
I would disagree with that. Back to what we were just talking about, and you alluded to, is the failure of Reconstruction. We had a moment, right? We had a moment from, say, 1868 with the ratification of the 14th up to 1877 and the compromise that ended Reconstruction. There was a moment there to move past the whole from the very beginning prior. I mean, the earliest colonial establishments of enslaved labor in the North American continent and in the Caribbean. We had the chance to move past that, and we failed. The courts failed, the institutions failed, our leadership failed, and so I don't know. Even with the idea of moving forward to that modern concept of affirmative action, I don't think that was in terms of reconciliation or in terms of reparations. I don't think that did it. So.
I came across, and this is to all of you, I'm curious what you think. I came across another source in which the author argued that if we had just followed through with an initial directive at the end of the Civil War, which provided for 40 acres and a mule for all established freedmen, that if we had followed through with that, the rest would have been, we would have solved the question of reparations and providing justice, because African Americans would have had property rights. They would have had, therefore, an economic investment. They could have built on their capital formation and things like that, and history would have played out very differently. I know that's not a comfort zone for all of you, but I was just wondering what you think about that idea. 48 acres and a mule had been implemented, that history would have been drastically different when it came to race relations.
Well, I'd say it would be drastically different, but I don't know that it would have solved. I think those may be two different things. I mean, who knows how that would have unshaken. I mean, there's some great speeches by Thaddeus Stevens. He goes through all the math. I mean, Chris's comment about the money issue in reparations, I think it was on, it might have been in Congress, or it certainly was on the campaign trail when he was running for re-election. He goes through all the math, does all the acreage, and, and he has this plan, and he basically says, if Southerners resist this, you lost, sucks being you. So, so there's all kinds of rattle and hum and discussion about what later was the Freedmen's Bureau policy that was going on at the time, involving the economic analysis.
I think that had the Freedmen's Bureau been able to finish what they started, I think we would maybe have seen a little bit different outcome, a little bit, at least in terms of property, and be able to, in terms of generational wealth. But what happens is that all that property that the Freedmen's Bureau's gotten to redistribute was taken away and given back to the redeemers. And so here's the government holding out a promise to these people. Here, we're going to give you some property, continue doing what you're doing now, but now you own this property, and you're moving up in society. We all know that property ownership is a huge thing in terms of getting into society. And then they take it away. And it's, Foner writes about this quite a bit. Eric Foner is probably the preeminent historian on the Reconstruction period. And in his book, Second Founding, he talks about this a great deal.
I think it would have been we'd be in a better place if we would have followed through. But for me, the baseline focus is just white supremacy. And it was most of the nation were not where the radical Republicans were. And I think that as what did Martin Luther King say when he went to Chicago? It was the most racist place he'd ever been. That Northern racism was worse than
Yeah.
Southern racism. I don't know if 40 acres and a mule solves that. And I think that once Black citizens have property and therefore have power, as that spreads out of the South, as we know it will, um, we're probably going to face the same obstacles and the same kind of biased assumptions we have about people.
Look what
Yeah,
happened.
you ask folks in Tulsa.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
exactly what I was going to say.
yeah, you
Tulsa.
got a black middle class. Yeah, I mean, I think Mike's onto something there. Yeah.
You
So
see that. You see that throughout. You see that throughout the nation in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Right.
well,
Yeah.
let's take this to very present, and I think that's kind of where the question to some degree is going, and that is where are we today in 2025, Professor Williams? It seems to me that the approach of the Trump party to race, slavery, the history of race relations is let it go. Let's move forward. Let's just leave it in the past. That policies based on the desire to provide some sort of justice after so many years only leads to more division in society. And I would say that there is some polling data that supports that premise. What I'm wondering is, as a political scientist, how do you, how would you, deal with your students on that approach to race policy?
Yeah, I think it's ahistorical, maybe anti-historical. And I would have the students think about their family units or a group of friends and ask themselves if there is a major issue that has been in that unit, is it best to just ignore it and to just say, oh, we'll just move on? Is that gonna solve it down the road? Or at some point do you have to actually address it? Um, there are many different interpretations of history, obviously, but on this, as we've discussed today and on other programs, white supremacy, racism, slavery it's at the beginning, it's at the founding, and it's there throughout, and that has consequences, as Chris was just talking about, right? It has consequences in terms of the wealth that people can get, the rights that people can exercise, and you look at every political and social and economic data point that there is out there, and every single one of them, Black Americans are disproportionately at the wrong end of whatever you're measuring. And I just don't believe, and I don't think there's evidence that that's because that Black Americans don't work as hard, that they somehow don't have the ability to achieve. Um, but it wasn't a starting point where everyone was starting equally. So I think I find it really, really frustrating. I think the pendulum can swing too far in either direction. I think that can happen. Um, but to just wish it away, or to just the 1776 Commission, to get rid of all mentions of DEI, so you're getting rid of pages on Jackie Robinson, the Pentagon's website, because you just don't want to talk about how race is a factor that should be part of our calculations about where we are today. I just think it's foolish. And to your question about what other places have done, Chris has already mentioned South Africa and the TRC. And in that process, there were reparations there. They did try to give money to people, like, okay, you lost your husband, we will give you money. The South Africans I've talked to, that was the least, that is not what they cared about. They appreciated that there was a hearings and a document where those in power admitted that what they did was wrong, and they took some accountability, and they said, okay, we're going to move forward from here. You see the same thing in Germany with the way that remembering the Holocaust. I mean, I wish America was more like, or Canada with indigenous peoples here recently. I don't know. I wish America had more of that in ourselves. We seem to get pulled in this direction of individualism, and everyone is just accountable for themselves. And so let's just start at the now and move forward. But you can't do that, I don't think, in a fair way. There are systemic consequences of slavery and racism that we still have not fully accounted for, in my estimation.
Were there reparations for Japanese American interns? Am I
Yes,
remembering that right?
in the 1980s.
Yep.
Yeah.
And only to direct survivors,
Yeah.
not children of it.
Yeah.
And so it was actually a very minimal number. It was under President
Right.
Reagan.
Well, if
Well,
the
it might be a
children,
bad precedent, but at least
if
there's precedent,
if you were if you were a child, Chris, and were interned, you know, so I guess that's what you meant. But
No,
Yeah.
yeah. But if you weren't, if you had to have been in one of the camps to
right,
get a
yeah,
check.
because I think Mike, I don't know if you had the teacher at East, Miss Johnson. She was interned.
Yep.
And she, taught English, and then, in fact, for a year or two, taught in our history department. And we had a long conversation. She was at Manzanar. They moved to Hawaii immediately afterwards. But yeah, she received it was $20,000. As she said, it was pittance relative to what they lost at the time there. So there were reparations, which is part of the. I think, Tim, you bring up an interesting point. It's part of the argument is that some African Americans say, wait a minute, you paid reparations to Japanese Americans. Why not African Americans who suffered far more economic and political damage to that? So, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time together on this Unit 2 question. So it is now time for your final thoughts and recommendations. Professor Kavanaugh.
I put a couple of things in the show notes and some programming this weekend on C-SPAN with some pretty serious scholars. One of the programs is Slavery and the Declaration of Independence, and then Abraham Lincoln and the New Birth of Freedom. That they're two different programs, pretty solid, as well as a program on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's a very recent thing. So I would advise students to check those out to go beyond our discussion here. I think this is a difficult topic. I think we still struggle with it. And I'm going to go back to the thing Mike was talking about just now. You can't move forward unless you deal honestly with the past and our reluctance by so many people to, erase the past or say, oh, well, that was then, we're not. So the idea that our reluctance to deal with our own issues and whether we want to sweep it under the rug, there's a long river in Egypt called denial, whatever it may be. It's difficult to move forward on the topic of race without being honest about it. And I would also encourage students to go check out a thing called The American Dilemma by a guy named Gunnar Myrdal that was done in the 1940s about race in America, and see if anything has changed. See if you think anything has changed. It's a very powerful report done by an outsider.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, when I teach on this, and I haven't taught on this since the last election, so it'd be interesting when I get back. We talk about these issues, and I tell the students, this isn't about if you are white. This is not about guilt. This is not about that you should be somehow feeling that bad about yourself. To me, it's about just acknowledging the reality of the system that you are in and what your racial identity has, how it's factored. So I tell the students, my father, when he was 5, and my grandmother came out from Arkansas in 1940, and they bought a house in Bakersfield, and they weren't rich at all, right? And my dad bought his first bike, bought his first baseball glove, right? They were like probably lower middle class and built his way up, right? And I tell the students, the same family, black family coming out to Bakersfield that time couldn't buy a house in the neighborhood because there were racial covenants. That alone, I mean, we sold my grandmother's house when she passed away, right? And that money went to, I think, help pay off some of my student debt. I mean, all of this stuff matters. And it's not about the guilt. It's about just acknowledging of where you're at in the system. And hopefully that will lead you to being empathetic and searching for public policies so so everyone can kind of find their own success.
Professor Moore.
I think students should seriously think about this question. I can foresee some judge at nationals asking a very simple question. Is the Constitution pro-slavery or anti-slavery? Because we've been we've been talking about that. And I think a judge might ask that. And there's all kinds of stuff out there on the interwebs on that question. You know, there's the arguments that it is and arguments that it isn't. But I'll put some of these in the resources because I think that's the kind of the uber question here. Is it a pro-slavery document or an anti-slavery document? So that would be my recommendation. It's a very simple but very complex question to answer.
So, Professor Kavanaugh mentioned, and Professor Williams, we can't move forward until we address the past. And I would say that in 2025, ladies and gentlemen, we're actually moving backwards there. If you look at the administration's treatment of history, heck, even the erasing of, it was temporarily, but of Jackie Robinson from the historical record within the military websites. But this just caught my attention the last 24 hours. The Trump administration has dropped a policy prohibiting contractors from having segregated facilities. It's now okay to have segregated facilities based upon federal law, I guess, here, and that's just shocking to. Hopefully, that's shocking to all of us. And so, in some ways, and yeah, Tim is right. If I think that's an excellent question, but I don't know how you get through this question. Well, I do know how because it's been mentioned here. Race. This is a very tough question. Race is a very tough issue. Very few people feel comfortable talking about this issue. And that has been our problem as a country. Maybe we could learn something from South Africa there, but I do understand that some 76,000 white people are leaving South Africa, Mike, under the Trump offering there. So maybe there's still serious problems in South Africa, and their approach didn't work as well. I don't know, but I will say this: we're not only here to provide you constitutional insights and hopefully some thoughts to help you prepare for the national finals, but we're also pretty good at geography, as hopefully you learned that there's a big river out there called the Nile there from Professor Kavanaugh. And here's one thing I definitely know for sure: the FOPs will not be establishing a Roger Taney fan club. That's not going to be happening with the Friends of Publius here. So in our next episode, you can let your Unit 5 friends know that we'll be finishing up our season by talking about free speech. I just find that so ironic that that's what we get to do in our final session. So until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.